Okay, welcome everybody on this snowy night in Washington. Thanks for joining us. We're obviously here on Zoom because the weather's a little bit challenging, but we are here for a conversation hosted by Campaigns and Elections magazine and the School of Media and Public Affairs at GW. And the topic today is how digital natives are reshaping politics and voter outreach. My name is Oren Schur. I am a partner at SKDK. We're a Democratic advertising and public affairs firm. We develop messaging and produce advertising for Democratic candidates from president, senators on down, and progressive organizations. Prior to joining the firm, I spent 15 years on the campaign trail as a communication director and campaign manager. And I also currently teach a course at SMPA in political campaign communications. And perhaps most notably, I graduated from SMPA 22 years ago, Polycom major. And when I graduated, when I was at GW, we did not have Facebook. We didn't have social media. We had AOL Instant Messenger. It was awesome. But the internet was just making its way into our politics, mostly as a fundraising tool. Obviously, the world has changed a great deal since then, and I've got a panel of experts who work and experience that day to day in their professional lives. And I want to give them here a chance to introduce themselves. So I'm going to call on each of you to give a short intro, and then we'll have a conversation. For those of you listening, feel free to submit questions. We will do a Q&A or a question and answer session at the end, toward the end of the hour. But as you think of questions as we go, please submit them as you're able to. Emma, why don't we start with you? I'm going to go in the order you're looking at me in. So, Emma, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, all. I'm Emma Holler. I was most recently the Deputy Digital Director for Senator Bob Casey's reelection campaign in Philly. Before that, I briefly worked on the Hill for Senator Bennett, and then I worked on Senator Maggie Hassan's reelection campaign in New Hampshire. And I started my career in my home state of North Carolina on Cal Cunningham's Senate race in 2020, all in digital. So excited to talk with you all tonight.
Great. Thank you. Brenna.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brenna Parker. I just most recently was the digital director for Secretary Pete Buttigieg at the Department of Transportation. And before that, worked at the White House as digital director to Vice President Harris. Have worked in Washington for about 8 years now at the intersection of pop culture and social impact. So I've worked on a lot of the post-Obama White House work from Mrs. Obama's Reach Higher initiative to When We All Vote and Dr. Biden's College Promise campaign.
All right, great. Celia.
Hey guys, I'm Celia. I'm a managing director here at Targeted Victory, which is a right-leaning digital advertising, digital fundraising, and public affairs firm. Here I lead our digital political advertising efforts, which I've led in 2024, more in the advertising space, looking at advocacy and how we reach right-leaning audiences in this new kind of GOP-dominated DC. Before that, I've led congressional, gubernatorial, and Senate teams here at Targeted Victory as well. And then I kind of got my start in politics in my home state of Massachusetts on Charlie Baker's reelect, and then worked in South Carolina 1 and in the Louisiana gubernatorial race. So happy to be here.
Love it. So we've got the Democrat from North Carolina and the Republican from Massachusetts.
That's right. Yes.
And Ethan, our student participant.
Yeah, hi guys. My name is Ethan. I am a junior at GW in the School of Media and Public Affairs, studying political communication. I also have interned as a digital intern for the House Oversight Committee Democrats and as a digital intern for the Democratic Party of Virginia previously.
Okay. Why don't we get started? So, as I noted at the top, you are all of the digital native generation. I guess I'll say I'm going to consider myself just above it, but like trying my best. I guess my question to the group to kick us off here: what is unique about the digital native? I'll say generations. I think we're probably in the second one. And in terms of how they consume, how you consume information about politics, what makes that experience unique? Brenna, maybe kick it off with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's unique about our generation is that we're the first one to grow up only really knowing technology and how we get our news and information. We're the cohort that's not, signing up for our local newspaper and getting our news from CNN or, and even though I do subscribe to an old-fashioned newspaper and watch CNN, but this is a generation that grew up getting a lot of their news information off of social media, and so that I think is the thing that is unique and distinct to us.
Okay. And Emma, do you want to jump in? I mean, okay, so if you're accustomed to it, you grew up with it,
Yeah,
what's it mean about you?
I think it also means that like there's like pros and cons, I feel like, to our generation. One is like we are incredibly informed. We have like I think everything at our fingertips with our phones, being able to like really do in-depth research on any political candidate or topic that we're interested in. But at the same time, I think we can also get stuck in an echo chamber and see only things that, once again, that we're interested in, and it can create more of a polarizing voters instead of someone who I think older generations might be a little more inclined to see more in the middle.
Hmm. Well, that's kind of an interesting point you raised that maybe we can build on. Right, the internet allows you with so much ease to surround yourself with views you agree with. Right, I mean it is easy to create your own echo chambers, you said, or a bubble to live in. Um, Celia, what kind of challenges does that create for campaign operatives? Or if you want to speak to the broader question, that's fine
Yeah.
as well. But
I think too, the thing to think about with this generation is that's the generation of instant gratification. These are people who don't want to watch linear television and be succumbed to 20 minutes of an hour program with all advertising. We're people who I pay myself for 7 different streaming platforms with no ads, so I don't have to see a single advertisement ever see a single advertisement. And the way that we have to think about reaching these people in these election cycles now has become a lot more intricate and a lot more complex to some degree. But at the same time, for people like us and our age, we grew up with this, so we also know the ways to still reach these people. I think you're going to continue to see a rise of streaming advertising. It's going to be, I personally think it's going to overtake linear a lot sooner than some linear people are saying. I think you're going to see a rise in something like contextual advertising, as with the depreciation of cookies over the coming years. And I think these sorts of pockets, and especially as our generation sort of comes up in the political world, are going to become more and more relevant, as opposed to putting 1,000 GRPs on TV last week, or, in the next week again, and you're going to burn a message and then you rotate your message, with 1,000 GRPs the next week, sort of thing, if that makes sense.
okay, yeah. Well, Ethan, let's bring you into this. So, uh, tell me about your experience as somebody in school involved in politics, like so many of the students there are. What are you seeing and feeling that you think is reaching you, or that makes folks your age kind of unique to political consumption?
Yeah, I think kind of building off a lot of what Celia said, speed is the big thing. We have really, really short attention spans. So if there's things that people see that they're able to understand very quickly, it has a greater impact. And I also think when there's political content put out there that strikes some sort of emotion in the sense that people want to reshare it or repost it or send it to someone, that performs a lot better than just general information being put out there. So you see a lot more call to actions, you see a lot more awareness being raised. Anything that kind of has that kind of dramatic factor does a lot better with the shorter attention spans that I think a lot of digital natives in our generation have.
I think too, not to jump back in here, but the
Yeah,
kind of
go ahead.
that we consume is, and I saw this year, we did this on a couple ballot initiatives and on a couple of races, that we weren't making static graphics anymore that just had your key messaging points. We were making memes and we were making GIFs. We were making 6-second videos based on trending content, not necessarily the plug and play of here are your core messaging tenets, let's go make them into a 30-second TV ad. It was fast, it was constant, and anything that was trending, we were trying to jump on it to capture the attention of that 18 to 34, 18 to 45 audience, which is, for me, the first time I've seen this since, I've been doing this since the 2018 cycle, and that was pretty new this year. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. And I think, 2025 with Virginia and New Jersey will be an interesting test case to see if that continues to grow, or if we see sort of a pullback in trying to reach this digital native generation.
So, kind of building on that, would you say that for the campaign operatives, for the folks who are trying to reach these voters, there is a heavier burden to create more you're just creating more content, right? You have to be set up in a way to do that. What, for you had mentioned kind of the linear generation, right? Where you're having a very almost sequential conversation with voters, right? You have ads on TV, then you have the next ad, then you have the next ad. How should campaign operatives think differently about the world you're speaking to with the need for more kind of rapid content creation?
It's a good question. I think that you shouldn't, I think this is where the line gets a little bit difficult. You can't move away from your core messaging tenets. You can't move away from your data. You can't move away from your polls. You can't suddenly start just doing stuff that's trendy and it appeals to people and it might get a lot of shares and retweets. It's about finding the intersection between both of them. I think I'll use Amendment 3 in Florida. We had a lot of content based on a lot of strong messaging points, but we pulled in influencers. We made GIFs and like rapid response memes that was still on message, but not so out there that you had no idea it was about Amendment 3, or you had no idea we were for it or against it, sort of thing. And I think the people who are going to be good at that are the people who are coming up now, not necessarily, people who are the linear generation, if that makes sense.
It does. Not offended. Still young.
I was no
So
offense.
I had promised you guys that this would not, and I think for everyone's benefit, that this would not be one of those like postmortems where we analyze every element of 2024 and why one side were dumb and the other were brilliant, and we won't do that. But Brenna, you've mentioned that, right, that you did work on the digital team for Vice President Harris. So I do think if you're willing, it's helpful to, I think it'd be interesting for the group to hear your reflections specifically since you were, with the Vice President's team. Of course, she was on the ticket. What your reflections looking back were on that experience, what went well, what could have gone better from a kind of a digital standpoint.
Yeah, well, I think honestly, like even looking back even further, in 2020, I was on the editorial and the social team for Vice President Biden at the time, and I managed his Facebook page and then the daily updates to JoeBiden.com. And when we met with the Facebook executive team, this was like in September, like right at the beginning of the general. The thing that Facebook told us at the very beginning was, Democrats are really good at posting 9 to 5, and you have to think about how you have voters who live in all different time zones all over the globe, and you need to be constantly reaching people all day long. So we made a very intentional decision to really focus on quantity and making sure that we were posting. If the vice president was doing I guess President Biden was doing an event, we had 5 different mediums for what one message was going to be. So we had to make sure that we had a photo and a graphic, plain text post, if it was a video or like a link. So we were taking one message and putting out 5 different pieces of content. So we reached every single voter. And I think, coming out of that experience, it really taught me a lot about how you segment that content. And in the White House, I think that the tricky thing was, we really weren't set up with a really robust digital infrastructure, and that was really, really challenging. I think, there's many different things that I could talk about here, but I think the news cycle in which we operate and just how long approvals would take. So like sometimes a tweet would get like a 12-hour approval on one thing, and then we've missed the moment and we're trying to get, something out. So I think the thing that I'm always thinking through, and I talk about this a lot, people like Ben Shapiro are posting every 3 minutes on platforms like Facebook. And if we're looking at the vice president's message for the day, if I only get like 2 or 3 tweets out a day, we're never going to like out message and out compete, some of these right-wing, media ecosystems. And so I think that was kind of one of the bigger challenges that we had to think through, because we had very, very little resources and a digital infrastructure that we had to build from the ground up for her office. But yeah, that was kind of one of the bigger challenges too, because we just did not have the same amount of resources that a lot of other folks did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me throw a question out there that builds off of. Oh, Emma, you came off mute. Did you want to
I
say
was just
something
going to
about
briefly
last
build
cycle?
off.
You were in the middle of last cycle as well. I know everybody here was in different ways, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to build off of just talking about like approval processes. And I think something that most people that worked in campaigns or anywhere where you have an approvals process, I think what I've noticed is I think the approvals process when it comes to Democratic messaging is a lot probably more stricter than I think Republicans have. I think the right is a lot more off the cuff. I think we tend to be more polished, and I think that is something that we are reckoning with, I think, in this cycle coming up. And I think something that we can focus more, like Brenna was saying, um, while the left or right is doing like multiple posts at throughout the day, like we're getting like 2 to 3 posts out on a topic where we've missed the moment already. And I think really it's really important to probably focus less on being polished and more on the gritty messaging that people want to see.
Okay. Well, let me ask Celia, you made a point a couple minutes ago where you kind of said, okay, we've got to generate all of this content. We've got to be nimble. We've got to kind of feed the beast and put a lot out there. But at the same time, we do have to remain tethered to the polling and to the data and to the messaging that we know will work with the voters who kind of matter most to us in a given race. And I guess I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about the tension, perhaps, maybe you disagree with that characterization, but the tension between the types of content that you think, okay, this is very shareable, very spicy, very like hits the moment. The activists will love it with, okay, what does my swing voter need to hear about my candidate or hear about my opponent? Is that a tension that you feel? Is that a mischaracterization? How do you kind of work through that? I kind of invite whoever wants to speak to that.
I would say I don't think that I think it might be a little bit of a mischaracterization because I think at least on, I don't want to make this overly partisan, but on my side of the aisle, like we have to ease people into some of the trendier content. I think, you both made the point that, Republicans are fast and more quickly with approval processes. I would say that's at the top. That is the Ben Shapiro's and the Matt Walsh's of the world. The congressional level, at the Senate level, at the gubernatorial level, especially at the gubernatorial level, you have people who are a little bit stricter. And so you have to sort of ease them into it, and they see that, a lot of times we do get swing voters who engage with audience because we stuck to our core messaging tenet at the end of the day. The content might be more shareable, it might be more trendy, it might be that meme of the guy who is standing up and it's in like I'm talking about some meme. I can't think of the actual name of it. But it's still on message. And as long as it's on message, you're like, hey, you're having a problem reaching 18 to 34-year-old swing voters. This is something that most of them are sharing on X or on TikTok or Instagram right now. It's easy to realign their thinking on it. And you do see some more engagement on it. And then they start to become more comfortable with it long term. And I think we've sort of played this game on the right, at least over the last couple of years of, really becoming more mainstream, I think is probably the way to say it. And it's getting easier and easier cycle over cycle on our side of things because we don't lose the message at the end of the day. We're not doing something for the sake of doing it or because our opponent did it or because, President Trump did it. It's because it's in the message and it's going to get eyes on your content.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think on the other side of that, I think just one of the cons of trying to be over polished is that it can bog down the messaging on our side, and it can almost come off as inauthentic. So I think just trying to work through that and keep it clear and authentic to who you're speaking to.
Brenna, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I actually come from this from a different lens. I mean, working in the federal government, we have a lot of restrictions on what we can and cannot do. We can't even do paid ads, and we're not, necessarily talking to voters. But, I think when you look at Secretary Buttigieg's work, we had a couple of pillars of how we used his channels to engage on content on a national level. One was that, part of his role as secretary is that he's a public information officer for a lot of the core work of the department. And so even just trying to get people to wear like seatbelts, why we wear a helmet, no drinking and driving, that sort of thing. But also I think like in our whole messaging of like how we're telling the story around the infrastructure law, we knew that, it wasn't going to be a huge content stream for like, say, the White House channels or, the president's channel. So how could we kind of fill that role? But we were thinking of it more so in a couple different buckets, but we actually made such a big investment in long form storytelling because we understood that part of our work was to almost be historians for this work. We weren't expecting, reporters and documentarians to, document this. So we had one person set on long form storytelling that went around the country and interviewed workers who were going to benefit from some of these jobs, and the labor groups that were, seeing these huge investments in their communities, and telling that story, because we knew no one was going to do it. And yes, it's not a short form, 6-second piece of content, but we were able to do multiple different messaging tracks and content tracks around this idea of, celebrating the work of the infrastructure law and telling that story.
Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about candidates, the human beings who are behind all of this. And Ethan, why don't we bring you in a little bit? Talk a little bit about how much, right? There are things we can do as operatives, but we are at the end of the day working for human beings who all have their own um, uh, uh, human characteristics and things that come more naturally to them than other things. And I guess um, I'm wondering from your vantage point, are there certain candidates who have kind of gotten this, so to speak, better than others in recent years that you can think of, or maybe prototypes of a candidate that are better suited to communicate to digital native voters, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think kind of there are two sides of it. The first person that I, of course, would talk about, and I know it's kind of cliche as a young person, but it's definitely AOC. I have a lot of my friends send me her content a lot because she does, I think, every single day post some sort of video explaining what's going on, has subtitles, will do live streams all the time talking about what's happening, really keeps up with the news. And then also, I think what's really important in digital content to appeal to the digital native generation is authenticity. So I remember when Kamala Harris had chosen Tim Walz, they immediately started pushing out tons of videos of him going to the fair, him doing this, and I remember so many thousands and thousands of comments of young people going, "This guy reminds me of my dad. This guy reminds me of my neighbor." So I think that it's like putting out content that makes candidates seem authentic, as well as, there's that lens, and then there also is the lens of, for elected members, just being out there themselves, and for the ones that control their own social media accounts, putting out their own content and keeping up with the news and keeping everyone informed. I think that both of those are uh, really big kind of media things that play well with the digital native generation.
Well, for the rest of the group, Celia, Emma, Brenna, you guys all work with candidates. Can you share a little bit peel back the curtain on the experience of working with candidates who are probably not of the digital native generations, but nevertheless need to communicate with them? What's that experience like? Where have the ups and downs been? Does anyone want to share a little bit there?
Yeah, I think having worked with two like incumbent senators who both did not have like pre-established digital departments beforehand, just because the state of digital back in 2016, 2018, I think you're oftentimes building it from the ground up and on a campaign. And I think you have to understand the limitations of your principal and see like you want to be authentic, you want to create content that people like react to and appreciate, but at the same time, you don't want to force anything. And I think just like finding these niche things that you can really plug into, like I think they did a great job with Tim Walz and kind of creating like just being America's dad. I think something we worked with on Senator Casey was really enjoys an IPA, so we did beers with Bob, which I thought was fun. Just like I'm obviously not the most like groundbreaking, but little things like that you can like put online to just reach people you probably wouldn't reach. I also think something that is important is just also creating content without the principal on his or on their social media. We would do like tiny mics in reference to like the Steelers versus Eagles games and different things like that with like someone from the campaign. So just like being creative with how you create content that will do well in front of digitally native people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think too, on the right, it's been a little bit harder to create some more sort of authentic content, and getting something like a direct to camera iPhone video is awesome. And I think I'm actually a huge fan of a direct to iPhone or direct to camera iPhone video on a social media channel. Like, hey, I'm driving across the state today. Here's where I'm hitting. Would love to see you there. Is far more authentic to somebody, especially some of these people, as you mentioned, who are not of the digital native generation, and then let your team account or let your team, film the man on the street videos with the younger group of people, because that's more authentic to the brand as opposed to the member or the candidate themselves trying to create this digital content that they're not familiar with, and it seems awkward or it seems forced or something like that. That if you can get something casual from them, that's great. And then you can have someone else be kind of the validator or the driver in reaching that younger group of people on your organic channels or on your paid channels. I've seen both.
And have you found that it is generally easy to get candidates comfortable with that? Are they coming around to the necessity of it? Is that kind of a battle behind the scenes in the campaign a little bit to the generational battle? How does that play out?
I think back to 2019 when I was in a campaign, it was hard. It was pulling teeth. And because it wasn't that common, and it was, kind of a year before COVID where everything went online. And so it wasn't this sort of I think now it's more it's normal in a campaign. Like, hey, you're at a press stop. There's tons of people behind you. Optically, this looks great. Let's film a quick video and wrap up your day and where you've been going. And those sorts of things are easier to just mention. They're like, okay, great, I'll go do this now. As opposed to even 4 years ago, getting my candidate to film a video was like, we're gonna set it up. Here's exactly what I think you should say. Whereas now a lot of these guys can be off the cuff or off script, and it's quick and it's easy. But it's come a long way in even just 2 cycles or 3 cycles. So
Something that we did with Senator Casey was we just had our senior video producer with him basically all the time, to the point where he was almost like a second or like sixth member of the Casey family. So I think that really helped our principal, just like becoming comfortable. And after like over like a year and a half, he's can finally like be comfortable with what he's saying and doing an off the cuff video. So just the constant drumbeat.
I think working for Pete was a really great experience, and that it was one of the first times I've ever had a chance to work for a principal. Not only did they understand, why digital was important, but they really prioritized it and infused it within our entire comms work. And so, he really understands the importance of really good storytelling and why we need to invest in it. And it was the first time I got a chance to really have a seat at the table for our work, and we were allowed to be creative and take risks and really think strategically about where can we place him on the internet that nobody would expect to see him. And I think one of our best examples of that, I mean, when I started, I had this idea of why don't we just focus on doing like social first podcasts where, we'll place him on a show, and then all of the clips coming out of that are like, TikTok, 15-second video reels. And it's not anything groundbreaking, but like, we put him on a hip hop podcast up in New York to talk about investments we were doing in the Second Avenue subway. And they had never had, an elected official on that show. But because we didn't have a lot of the restrictions that, the White House has to deal with vetting and certain approvals on stuff, we were allowed to just do it. And they had never had an elected official on there. And so I think that's kind of, where I think, politics is going to go a little bit more of like trying to take more risks in how we engage with creators and podcasters. But yeah, I mean, I think it really it starts at the top. We need to have we need to have candidates and elected officials that understand that digital is important, but they understand what the investments of that look like. And so if your team doesn't have a good digital infrastructure starting off, you're never going to be able to get to those, creator engagements, podcast engagements. If you're still fighting through, an approvals process that, takes too long, or you don't have basic equipment and video equipment to film things. But, a couple of thoughts.
I think if I can say one last thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think also coming from digital native generation, it is very easy to tell which politicians post their own content and which don't. I mean, obviously not everyone posts all their own content, but like I can think of right now, like Senators Schatz, Murphy, are always tweeting at each other. Even like Vice President JD Vance replies to his own tweets. So those politicians are getting content out. Cory Booker is doing live streams from his car all the time. Those politicians are getting content out so much quicker and so much faster than the ones that have than the ones that probably don't even know the logins to their social media accounts and have their communications teams do everything. So I think that like coming from like the digital native generation, it's very easy for us to tell. And then that kind of plays a little bit more into the authenticity aspect that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah. Brenna, you made an interesting point because, when I was coming up, we in the kind of the desire to sometimes over script, over vet, when we used to kind of applaud message discipline by one's ability to stick to a very precise script and to create a bubble around that candidate so that their entire existence was. And now it's almost become the ability of the candidate in the campaign to be nimble, authentic, risky, do things that are all, it's almost like you've got to internalize the core of who you are in your messaging, but then the art of campaigning is less your ability to stick to an exact script and more your ability to adapt and communicate that message in natural, authentic ways, and be willing to take some risks and realize that, maybe the mistakes are not as devastating as we used to think they were, because I think there might be a little bit more, I'm interested in what do you think, a little bit more forgiveness in the internet world, that not everything's going to be perfect. Not every soundbite's going to be perfect, and maybe people don't want them to be. All right. Let me shift to another uh, element of digital communications here, advertising, which we touched on a little bit, and that's what I do at our firm here. I know, Celia, your firm's very involved in that. With my students in SMPA, I often say that the digital native generations are professional avoiders of advertising, right? You guys, you came up, whereas the older generations almost have a relationship with linear television and radio, where you understand that you're going to watch for a while and then there's a commercial break, and you're going to watch for another while and then there's a commercial break. And most people aren't sitting there with their hand on the thing, flipping all over the place. Whereas, right, that generations that came up getting information online on their smartphones, on their computers, you're a much more proactive engager with those mediums. You're moving around, you're volume up, volume down, tab up, tab down, right? You're tab up, tab down. Um, what are the challenges, I guess, in reaching digital native voters, young voters, through advertising, right? When they know something is being fed to them in a paid, sponsored way, or maybe they don't know, maybe you don't want them to know. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? How do you get these voters to consume your ads? Anyone want to jump in? Celia.
I can start. I think I mentioned this kind of briefly before. I think this is only going to get more challenging. I think that, we sort of struggled with it this year, and we're going to continue to struggle with it because we do try to avoid ads so much. The thing I can start with and say, and hopefully build on some other thoughts that other people had and what you saw on the other side of the aisle, is I kind of look at it two things. One, you can't ignore things like social media. I think that, and we can have a larger discussion about this too. Influencers and the rise of influencers is definitely a way to reach.
We're getting there, so go
Okay,
ahead.
I'll hold until we get there because I have some influencers too. So that TikTok, and then, Facebook and Instagram and X, the rise of X, and we can talk about X in more detail as well. But streaming is going to continue to be important. YouTube is going to be a way to reach people. I think the best example I can give is that on the D-Trips website, and we worked in California 45, at the top of their notes about California 45 for what outside groups should be doing, it was go to YouTube to reach younger people, 18 to 44, YouTube. And we got outspent like 3-1 on YouTube in 2 weeks. And I think YouTube's going to be a huge player because most people consume their content on YouTube. And it's not YouTube TV or YouTube Select, it's YouTube on TVs. It's people going on their televisions and pulling up 6-minute videos on YouTube. 95% of my ads were shown on TV screens, and they were 6-second bumper ads. And I think from where I'm thinking about it, you have these two buckets of streaming and YouTube, and that's how you're going to continue to reach these people. Social media, I think, especially we use Meta, is going to start to decline year over year with reaching this 18 to 34, and then as they get older and move on, not going to be as important anymore, not going to be as large line items and budgets anymore. And so I think that's where we start. And then we're just going to have to continue to adapt. I think, podcasts will be super interesting coming into the 2026 cycle. I don't know if, I heard a really great ad on the Severance podcast where it was a seamless transition. It went from, they were talking about the TV show and it went right into an ad. And I had no idea it was an ad. That is going to be a super easy way to reach people. And I think we'll see what podcasts or how much political podcasts are willing to take. But with Harris on Call Her Daddy, Trump on Joe Rogan, I think you'll see a rise of that. People, that's where they consume their media from, and then influencers too. But I'll save my thoughts on that for a little bit.
So your theory on the advertising is that the streaming the opportunities to advertise on streaming platforms as opposed to social media and other static things that I don't know, creates maybe almost more of a I don't know, linear experience in a way, or right, if you're watching it on your wall and it's part of
It's a linear experience for younger people at the end of
yeah.
for people who are 18, 19, 30, 25, 26, 27. I go home at night and I watch short little YouTube videos about Severance or whatever it might be. And I get, ads that are tailored to me based on what kind of television I have, or sorry, based on what kind of content I'm consuming. So yes, that is where I was sort of going with that. And then on the streaming side of it too, like almost every poll I got back this year was like, you are missing people who are 18 to 37 years old who are streamers only. You need to move more budget into streaming yesterday. And we did. We funneled money into top streaming platforms, whether it was something like a Sling or a Fubo or a Tubi, or a Paramount Plus and a Peacock, or maxing out Hulu, or maxing out whatever YouTube auction inventory was available. Not even YouTube TV inventory, just regular old YouTube auction where you bid on specific content.
Brenna, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize is the federal government and a lot of elected officials can't even use paid advertisements. So everything they do is organic. And so that's why partnership work, influencer work is so important, because you get to reach people that are not already following you. But I think one of the things that we did with Pete that I thought was very successful was that we tried very hard to actually make our content or organic content not look governmenty. So the visuals, the color, even the typography around how graphics looked, how the edits on some of our videos looked. We tapped in a lot of the best practices that the fashion industry, the sports industry are using in a lot of their paid advertisements, and we just kind of tweaked it for a very important but very boring work of lane that we did, which was infrastructure. And so even if it was just like an investment or an ad on we're investing in so many amount of clean buses, right? Like we just took like trending audio and we took, we made the visuals look and feel a lot different than most people consume government content. And then, one thing that we did that we tried to tap into, if we had a really quick message that we wanted people to jump into, we would do react videos. If we saw something trending on Instagram or TikTok, we would try and find it on Instagram. And then the secretary would not only watch the video, but he would react to it. And there was a really great video that we did on Halloween where this woman was on the metro and she's like dressed as Sadness from Inside Out, and she's like, I can't believe I'm like the only person on the subway. And then he reacts to the video and he talks about it's really important that people use public transit tonight. But there's a lot of ways that elected officials in government can use the best practices in advertising and use it on organic, because you kind of have to.
Hats off for making the Department of Transportation not lame and boring. That's pretty good. Emma.
I was just gonna piggyback off of that. I think a lot of things, or what I've seen a lot in the government, especially on like Senate websites, is this change from like the classic format of a website to much more like beautiful branding and not so text heavy infographics online. So I think it creates a lot more accessibility for digitally native people who might be interested in like going to figure out what their congressman represents or something like that. So I think I think Pete did a great job with that. And I think a lot of people are trending towards that. In terms of ads, I think trying to tailor an ad to someone who is so digitally native, I think trying to just focus on authentic content that doesn't look like an ad. I think I can't remember who did it, but I think there was an ad last cycle of a woman coming home from the grocery store and talking about their candidate or their issue in an influencer-like way, but not being an influencer, it being an ad. So creating an ad in a sneaky way for the people that are looking for ads.
I also think there's something to be said for digital. I think you sort of alluded to this, Brenna, like digital out of home. I'm curious where that goes. I think it could be a really unique way to reach some of these, like, you can advertise on the gym screen or at a convenience store or whatever it might be. I did a little bit of it, but not enough to really have a strong opinion of it. But I do think that that could be an interesting way to reach some younger voters, because I watch ads when I'm on the metro or when I'm standing there waiting at the courthouse stop and just see what's going on. So I think that could be a new thing, or not. It's not new, but a thing that maybe we push more towards in coming cycles. But maybe that's just a hope and a prayer, and I'm wrong on that. So.
All right, so we've touched on it in a few places. Let's talk about influencers for a minute, because the idea of an influencers, as old as campaigns themselves, right? That we've always known that the most effective way to persuade somebody is from somebody they know and trust. That's just taken different shapes and forms, and how we get that person in front of the voter. That relationship is different now in an online world, where the people you know and trust, or the people you trust, you don't necessarily know, but you follow them, you trust them. They're the influencers, you may follow them. I mean, campaigns are now trying in different ways to leverage that relationship with the voter. And I guess I'd love to hear from you all, what your experiences with that have been, what you think is working, what have we not quite figured out? The other dynamic of it, and then I'll let you all talk, is, we most of our campaigns, and if you're not running for president, you're running for something that is bound by geographies, right? A state, a district, a city. That's how our elections are run. But most of the social media world where you're following influencers is not one bound by geography. So how do you think about that when you're running a campaign in a state or a district? So I'll kind of open that to the group, the influencer relationship, and how do we, the campaign operatives, maximize it? Anyone want to start? Celia?
I'll start. This is personal opinion, not where anybody I know stands, but I generally have a negative view of using influencers or going to influencers. I think that the issue that we run into with influencers is we sort of talked about this in the beginning, is that you're creating this echo chamber, and that an influencer who's, think about how your TikTok or your Instagram or your X algorithms are. They're all tailored to content that I consume, whether it's political or baking or whatever it might be. And I think that, an influencer is never going to be the person who sways a swing voter or helps somebody make up their mind, because you're sort of already in that algorithm already. You're there. And so I think that the benefit on the flip side is that a lot of influencers break down current events for people. They'll break down campaign issues. I think I saw something from Pew this afternoon or yesterday or a couple days ago, where it's 1 in 5 Americans get their current events from an influencer, and they find it easier to understand than trying to read a convoluted news article from the Times or Wall Street Journal or whatever. And so kind of tying this whole piece together, and I don't know if this super answers the question, and more it's we're going to have to continue to figure this out, I think, year over year. But like, the digital native generation will rely on influencers to break down information for them. Are they going to use an influencer to make a decision about who to vote for or what kind of policy they support? I don't know if we're there yet, because they're already in that target audience. And I don't know if it's going to be beneficial for campaigns who need to move 50,000 people in a state to win an election at the end of the day. That's my 2 cents. And I don't know if it's right or wrong, but generally I'm anti.
What do others think?
I definitely
Opportunities,
think
pitfalls? What do you think?
it's definitely a new frontier that I think will be used a lot in 2026. I think, I mean, we used influencers on the Casey campaign, and I think it was an opportunity to reach an audience that we wouldn't typically reach, especially younger voters. I think maybe less about trying to reach the middle voter and more about just trying to keep younger voters informed. We would use local influencers. We would do influencer briefings and just being able to like update them on the campaign to help just keep people aware of what's happening. I think, especially with local races or having just a Senate race happening simultaneously with the presidential, I think sometimes it can get drowned out, and just trying to keep your name at the forefront, I think, is really important in a campaign when it comes to fundraising, just in all aspects.
And can you talk for a minute? You said you recruited influencers. Is that so that you can get them kind of bought into what you're doing, so that they can go communicate
Yeah, just
in their style and way? Or
yeah, giving them talking points about the state of the race and just being able to give them what they need to go out and like create an authentic video for their viewers, I think, mostly.
I think to build on Emma's point, if you're using an influencer to energize your base or activate your base or like for fundraising purposes or mobilization purposes, I think that is probably where I would use them in a campaign if I were to leave my job and go run a campaign tomorrow. But I think the question of whether or not they can move an electorate is still up in the air. And they're great and they're flashy for social media, which we were sort of talking about before, but relying on them as part of a campaign strategy as part of the movable electorate anyway, I don't know if we're there yet.
And I'll also
Yeah,
jump off
please.
that and say one of the things with influencers I think that's also important to note is that they can also end up becoming a catch-22 because influencers themselves can be trends a lot of the times. Like there are a lot of influencers this election very popular on TikTok that 2020 last election no one even knew about. And there's influencers and how our generation moves so fast can be trendy, can be not, can be canceled very fast. So while they can mobilize a base, it also can absolutely become a catch-22 situation later down the road.
I think
Yeah.
it question.
So
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna briefly building on that. Just yeah, you can tie yourself to the wrong person or give them a message that they just can't convey as directly as you wanted. So there are pitfalls, but it's definitely, I think, a very interesting trend that will be used.
But it's like if they are authentic. It's like the same thing we were talking about before. Like, is a video from your congressman who's not a digital native having an influencer, is that authentic to their brand? I don't know. Is that part of their core messaging? I don't know I don't know the answer to that.
Seems like you got to let go of a little bit of control by
Yeah.
nature, right? And be like at peace with that. Brandon, did you want to speak to that? And then I want to get to Q&A here.
Yeah, I think this was something that we did really well with the secretary, and then part of this is all of this influencer work. Then when we're talking about this, a lot of it has to do with relationships, the relationships that you have with the creator, maybe their team, and or maybe the platform that helped connect you with them. But so much of it is trying to make sure that you are placing your principal in a situation or a piece of content that makes one sense for your message and what you're trying to get done, but also for their audience on their channel. And one of the things that we tried to do with our Investing in America series was trying to make sure that we were tapping into people that were that are creators, but also the people in these communities were a part of telling that story with us. So I mean, we worked with this young man named Delane Hurd who lives down in Birmingham, Alabama, and I found his Instagram scrolling on my Instagram. We were going to Birmingham in like 3 days, and he's this young man who lives in Birmingham who just genuinely loves his hometown, and he just thinks it's really cool, and he makes content about how great Birmingham is. And I sent him a DM and I was like, we're going to be in town, you want to interview the Secretary of Transportation about this investment we're doing? And 2 days later he was interviewing his congressman, his mayor, and the secretary. And so like stuff like that is like obviously very rare, but I think thinking through the content and how it works for a certain influencer, I think is really important. So one of the things that we did part of the infrastructure law was our robust investments in the disability community and making sure that America's transportation networks are accessible for future generations. And so we worked with Paralympian Matt Scott to help partner on this video project that we did for Accessibility for All. And he talked about in this video how he's gone abroad and he's won medals for the United States, but the hardest thing for him to do sometimes is just go into the grocery store because it's not accessible to him. And so we're thinking through that lens of here's a really great storyteller for this, not so the secretary. And so how can you tap into an influencer to help tell that story? Because that actually is a much better story coming from him than it is, say, like the DOT channels.
Great. All right, why don't we go to questions? I see okay. Why don't I go ahead and read these? Let's see, I've got a few of them let's see, I have one from my pal Joseph Lacey. Here at the top, why don't I read it to the group and you guys can speak to it. What effect, if any, has the meta ads library had on the work of the panelists, on you guys? Would you change anything about the ads library? Do you think other social media should be required to have something like it? Gets into the issues of transparency, regulation, which we have not tapped on, but how is the meta ad library, the ability to see what's going on, how has that impacted your work? Anyone want to speak to that?
I don't feel that I can not go first. Sorry, I feel like I just keep jumping in here, but I'm a huge fan. And I think it's something where Democrats and Republicans kind of meet in the middle. I love seeing what Democrats are doing. I think that it's super helpful to me to see what kind of content's being run, and tracking how much spend there is. I can't tell you how many competitives we made just on the Meta Ads library this last year to see like, were we going 1 for 1? Were we being outspent 2 to 1? Do we need to move more money to something like Meta? They kind of let you get in the weeds, and see, the targeting and at what age range it's more men or more women or where. And I found that exceedingly helpful as we were making recommendations to campaigns, because maybe, maybe it was only Meta, but it also kind of painted a larger picture, because you could go over to Google and see the same thing. Like, okay, they're running 2 different message tracks, this one on YouTube, this one on Google. It skews older on Meta as opposed to younger on Google. And it would inform campaign decisions, or at least suggestions and recommendations that we made to a campaign. I want every network to have an ads library, personally speaking. And I think it is somewhere where we all kind of meet in the middle. I think we all want to see what each other's doing, and I also think it makes us all better than we were before. Like, I think the best example I can give is Catherine Cortez Masto ran some, I think, really phenomenal creative in 2022, and I not copied, but I used it as inspiration for a lot of creative that I did this year. And I have a whole folder on my computer of content I found in the Meta Ad Library from different campaigns or high profile or really competitive races. So big fan of the Meta Ads Library. Hope it sticks
Oh,
around more.
and it's not just so we can see what we're each doing, it's so also the press and the public can see what
Yes.
we're doing, which is important too. Um, Let me move to the next one here. Which social media platform do you find currently is most effective at reaching specifically the less engaged voters? Do one of these platforms work better in your view?
I'm speaking from the digital.
Speaking on behalf of less engaged voters.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. I would say it would have to be. I feel like this is the cliche answer, but it would have to be TikTok. That is where it is hard for me to think of a person my age that does not have TikTok. That's where most of the stuff is coming from. And then if you had to choose a second place, I would say Instagram.
I think jumping off of Ethan's point, I also think YouTube, because YouTube really is like a database and a search engine in of itself. And so if you really wanted to look up, a certain topic on there, you really can find it a lot easier, and you can see a lot more historical content on there. But I think YouTube, that's where we've spent a lot of our time and resources and investing in.
One topic, this is an anonymous questioner, but something that we have not hit on here, which is obviously an interesting trend to keep track of here, but the impact of social or certain media apps either being banned, or I would say, since we saw the kind of the roller coaster with TikTok recently, but I'd say also media, we've also seen platforms decide not to accept political advertising during certain windows, or if at all. How much of your world is, where do you think this is going? Are we going to get more and more political advertising on platforms, or are platforms going to be spooked out of allowing it? Or is it going to get overregulated? Is it going to get less regulated? Where do you see this going?
I
Good.
I, I think that's a really, really hard question, because you think about something like TikTok that is so volatile, that's used more as like an organic platform since they don't take political advertising. I don't think you're going to see too much of a pullback from political advertising. I think this is not a 1 for 1, but even Mark Zuckerberg removing some of the fact checking stuff over the last couple of weeks. People want to be part of what's going on and part of these larger conversations, and not to mention political is a huge money making business for a lot of these platforms. I think we could see the first $10 billion midterm cycle. I mean, we don't know, like, more money was spent in 2020 than ever before. And I think just from a network's point of view, is that something that you necessarily want to give up? It'll make it harder on us, but I personally don't think that we're going to start seeing it being overregulated more. I think if anything, you might see some of the constraints come off a little bit. If anything, I had a couple ads where, we had to send back, our Oppo decks and say, like, here's the citations for all of this. Everything that we're saying is true. Please proceed. And I think maybe if anything, it declines. But that's a shot in the dark.
Yeah. Anyone else want to speak to that? No. This is a good question. Can you share some of the mistakes you feel that campaigns you worked with have made in regards to digital media?
I can
Who
jump in.
wants to share a mistake? The more embarrassing, the better.
I don't know if this is a mistake, but I think a repeated mistake I see made on digital is that linear ads are not digital ads, and that reaching an audience on linear is not the same as reaching an audience on digital. And I see still to this day too many campaigns wanting to put linear ads and cutting it into a 6-second or 15-second, or sometimes worst case scenario, they want to screenshot it and turn it into a display graphic. And we have to move away. There should be like digital first creative matters, vertical creative matters, short form creative matters. Like you can't just make one spot and expect it to work everywhere. And I think that's the biggest mistake that campaigns are making for digital to this day.
Anyone else have a mistake to offer?
I don't know if it's more of a mistake, but more a real lesson that I've learned in my career. But I think generally, and this goes for any public figure, any elected official, any social movement, really. You know, if you don't invest in telling your story and what your work is doing, and you know, people are going to tell it for you, whether that's the media or your opposition or just people online. And so I think one of the challenging things that I had to figure out when I worked in the White House was, the president had a 20-person digital team telling the story of the president and the first lady and the White House. And it was just me and a part-time videographer for the vice president. And for the sheer amount of work that we were doing, it was really, really hard to get really anything out the door. But just I don't know if it was investments that were made during the transition time or whatever. But we really should have they really should have invested more in digital for her, especially at the beginning, because you saw later nobody saw where she was. There was like a whole joke of like, where is she? Where is she? And she was doing really important work. The problem was we were doing so much that it impacted the amount of pre-production, post-production, and just work generally. And by the end, her team had made some of those investments. But yeah, I think that was a really big lesson for me, that you really need to invest in digital media and in equipment and in staffing, because you need that many people doing it. You really do need sometimes a 6-person video team, because that's what it takes to get a really effective video plan done. But I can speak on this all day, so I'm going to turn it over to somebody else.
I've got to start wrapping us up because we're coming up on our hour, but I would love for Emma, Brenna, and Celia to try to answer one last question in maybe like 20 seconds or less. Ethan, you take notes on this one, you'll hear why. The question for our digital strategist is what is your advice in 20 seconds or less to students who want to go into digital to become professionals, right? All the students are experiencing it in their lives, but how do they become professional operatives? What would your one quick advice be?
I'll just go very quickly. I think how I got into digital just was kind of by happenstance. I just started volunteering for a campaign, and then it just kind of happened to have an open job, and that's where I got involved. I think just being able to try new things and then just get involved and say yes, I think is probably one of the easiest ways to do it.
Okay, Brenna or Celia?
I think two pieces. One, be a really, really strong writer, and learning how to write for different mediums, I think, is a skill, but that's a skill that you can pick up, as you go along. But I think as a human people skill, learning how to be proactive. So, I think part of my success has been that if I have an idea for something, I pitch it, get buy-in, approval, okay, and then I just go and do it. But I think being proactive is a skill that will really help you in your career.
Mine would be always be open to learning something new and acknowledge that people across the aisle or your neighbors or your coworkers or people who've been doing longest than you or not as long as you could be better than this at you. And that the best thing about this field is that it always changes. People change, tech change, whatever else, and that you get better by learning from each other. I've learned so much from Democrats, social mediaists over the years or strategists over the years based on their targeting and their creative, and they made me better for it. So I've heard that they're better than me, so I went to go be as good as them. And I think if you can keep that mentality and not get bogged down into the partisanship of it, you can be a really strong operative and really talented in this field.
Ending on a bipartisan note of collaboration and poaching one another's ideas. No, learning from each other. That's a great way to end. Panelists, Emma, Ethan, Celia, Brenna, thank you all for doing this. Thanks for everyone who attended and submitted questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Did the best we could here, but and thank you, GW. SMPA continues to lead the way in all of these conversations, and I know that they're happy to partner here with campaigns and elections. So thank you everyone for joining, and good luck in the snow tonight.